Welcome to Silicon Slopes Friday Conversations. Today we're lucky enough to be joined by one of our great partners, Saprea. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and then we'll get started. Start with you, Derek.
My name is Derek Maxfield. I'm the founder of Younique, and then of course I'm associated with Saprea because that was the cause for which I started Younique, and I'm very happy to be here.
And I'm Chris Yadon. I'm the managing director at Saprea. Saprea is a nonprofit that exists to liberate individuals in society from child sexual abuse and its lasting impacts. And super grateful to be here as well.
Yeah, thank you guys. We had Saprea on the stage two and a half years ago, and as we all know, a lot changes in that amount of time. So we're going to set the table with a little bit of the founding story of Younique, and then the founding story of Saprea. And then we're going to talk about some interesting statistics, some interesting stories, but we're going to kind of put a pin in from 2.5 years ago to now, because there's been some interesting developments. So let's start with you, Derek. Quick background on the founding of Younique and ultimately how that tied into Saprea.
Yeah, so I was a software developer by trade coming out of BYU, and I had a software business called NetSteps that I started in 2003. And that's pertinent to the story because NetSteps did software for the direct sales industry. So my clients were, some of the largest direct sales companies that you would be aware of right here in the Valley. And then when I started Younique 11 years ago, I can't believe that it's been that long now, we started as a digital version of a home party company, right? So I built a platform that tied into Facebook and some of the others. At that time, social selling was kind of, I guess in its infancy. And so we brought the home party model to the digital world. And that was 2012. And I'm getting stuck on as to what I should say next. What's the founding story of Younique, Chris?
I think maybe share a little bit about the role Saprea had in the early days.
Yeah, so I sold my software business in 2010, and I was in a really self-reflective state. I was 35 years old, and I was trying to decide what to do with my life. And it was in that state of mind when I sort of started to become aware of some of the abuse of my sisters and some things that had happened. And I'm like a data guy, so I started to go to the data, and I was just overwhelmed with the data that I was finding, the prevalence of child sexual abuse. And then not just the prevalence of it, but how common it was for a woman to live in guilt and shame for something that literally was not her fault at all, but to just carry such guilt and shame. And it was in one of those moments that I was talking with my wife, Shalane, and I just said, that's not fair. Somebody needs to do something about that. And for me, it was one of those seminal moments, like the stars aligning, because I had sold my business, and in the last 2 years of NetSteps, I had been trying to talk my home party companies into doing the virtual party, right? So I had been trying to talk my clients into doing it, and never in a million years did I think I would start a direct sales company, especially not a makeup company. But it was in that moment, on that drive home, where it was one of those just wait, I guess I could start a business, and if it can succeed, then we can be the champion for that cause. And so, in the case of Younique, it really was the cause first and then the company. And I believe that, in part, that's why we were so successful. And so just a few years later, we were able to start Saprea. It was first known as the Younique Foundation. And we went through a rebrand just a couple years ago, which I'm sure we'll probably talk about that more. But yeah, that was the founding of Younique, and now we've had to reinvent ourselves, right? That was really novel and exciting and interesting, but the virtual party now, that's a very saturated business model, right? So we continue to have to evolve.
Yeah, that's a it's a fun story because you used one for the engine that would fund the actual original idea. So yeah, Chris, the founding story of Saprea has kind of been talked about there a little bit. You mentioned the one-line tagline. A little bit more about your involvement with Saprea when you joined, and a little bit deeper dive into the mission. And it's more of an open-ended question of what do you guys do, how do you do it, why do you do it?
Yeah, so a little bit more to make some ties on the founding. So I worked for Derek at NetSteps, the company that he mentioned, and that was the second small tech startup that I had worked in. So I came from tech, and you know, my skill set was helping in those early stage of tech startups. When they decided to found Saprea, Derek reached out to me, and they really took a different approach for what nonprofits usually go through. We treated Saprea very much like a startup. And we were able to do that because Younique Cosmetics had the financial means to incubate us, which allowed us to get our services up and going much faster than a typical nonprofit has. And not only get them up and going, but also get them researched to validate that they were actually effective. So when people come and look at Saprea today, they look at us, like in our industry, in the nonprofit industry, they look at us and they think we're a 30 to 50-year-old nonprofit, because nonprofits just scrap and they struggle to get to that type of effectiveness. It really speaks to the power of social entrepreneurship in accelerating the speed to actually have an impact. To the point today, we're 8.5 years old, almost 9 years old. We have third-party research on our programs that show how effective those programs are, both on the healing side as well as the prevention work we do. That's foreign to nonprofits. It's really hard for nonprofits to get there. So, you know, if there's anything that I'd want someone to take away from the founding of Saprea, is the value in having someone, in this case the Maxfields, willing to incubate the nonprofit, much like you would a for-profit startup. Having that social entrepreneurship vision that we're willing to invest because we believe the social return's worth it. You know, in terms of the other part of your question, kind of what we do, how we do it, at the highest level, we help adult women who are sexually abused as children overcome post-traumatic stress symptoms and reignite aspects of their life that allow them not just to heal, but to go through what we call post-traumatic growth. And that is when you're unburdened from the trauma that you experienced as a child, there's a tremendous amount of growth that an individual goes through. It's almost not like they're catching up because they're already phenomenal human beings, but it's like it's being unshackled with something that you're free from and liberated from. You just go through amazing growth cycles, and that's what we see in the research of those women that come through our programming. On the prevention side, we hyper-focus on parents and caregivers and helping them reduce the risk that their children will either be abused or abuse others.
Yeah, it's a big undertaking, and to the point where you mentioned the founding story and the getting squared away, right? Because a lot of nonprofits are not squared away. It looks like somebody in 1998 designed their website, and it's just limping along. To your point, looking at your website with your annual reports and like your third-party researchers, it's clear that it's like you guys are squared away. The money is utilized, and there's the mission, there's all the content, and you're thinking about it from multiple angles. But starting something, even with a little steam of wind behind you, is also tricky and difficult, right? It's not easy. In the early days, how did you guys go about, for entrepreneurs or those that might want to do nonprofits very similar, getting the stakeholders in place, getting the mission in place, and then starting?
I'll take that one. We used a lot of, I came from startup, and we used a lot of startup techniques. but not all of them work in nonprofit. For example, if you took, say, lean startup methodologies and, the speed to failure or, rapid testing and turnover, you can't do that with human beings. You cannot fail. You cannot invite a woman who's been sexually abused into your world and say, we will help you, and fail at that. So there are some places where kind of some of those startup things don't apply or work. And we had to be really careful in our early days figuring out where to apply those principles and where not to. With our social media campaigns and awareness, we could do it all day. It's exactly the same as the for-profit world. But when it came to the actual human services, that's a place you can't fail. With that said, there are still things that you can learn from startup principles of rapid iteration, early measurement. So our very first program that we ran in June of 2015, we were doing measurement. The very first one we did. So those principles of startup and entrepreneurship still apply because they help you get to right faster. But there are certain places like we couldn't fail. And so what we did to kind of bolster in those early days is we brought in very, very top-notch experts that had significant experience in the field to help make sure we didn't fail in the places we couldn't fail. And that's how we kind of balance the two.
Yeah, very cool and impressive. So you mentioned the unshackling, right? Like whether you've been sexually abused or not, or folks that have, everyone's probably walked around with a heavy backpack and they've taken it off and they feel immediately lighter and better, right? That's a physical sense, but mentally, unless you've gone through it and been through it, you don't know what that's like to have this weight on your shoulders, and it probably impacts your life as a parent, as a product manager, as a mom, whatever it is. That's a big undertaking to unravel that and then get that post-growth. Since Saprea was here last, I think the momentum and the headwinds have been overwhelmingly positive. Anecdotally, I bring up you guys a lot, and the conversations are different from my end, right? Like, you can't put that in your little research thing because it's just Garrett's idiotic anecdotal ramblings, but people are a lot more open to talk about it. You guys mentioned that, you're data-driven and you can't fail. What is the data showing in addition to the anecdotal? Because you can't poo-poo the anecdotal, right? Like, I sense it's a lot better of an environment.
I'll hit on the data. Why don't you hit on some of the anecdotal, Derek?
Yeah. I just wanted to comment really quickly on what you said just at the beginning of that, right? You said, if you know someone who has been sexually abused, and, I want to say fairly confidently that everyone in this room does know someone. And the data is very clear, that it's 1 in 5 children, right, before they're 18. 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys. And that's been the case for centuries, right? Is it right? So if that's feeling like it's becoming more of a topic and more awareness, right, around those numbers that are the reality, that's the positive headwinds, right? Every social change starts with awareness, starts with right? There first has to be just a simple acknowledgement of the problem, and this is a social issue that has been swept under the rug, sometimes by the parents themselves, far too often, right? A well-intended parent will talk to their daughter with phrases such like, well, are you sure? Or like, well, what, right? What did you do or say? Or even worse, right? Well, I don't want the family dynamic to be ruined, so why don't we keep this to ourselves? And that's like telling your daughter your healing is far less important than this person's, I guess, reputation. And that's just something that I have grown to feel extremely passionately about. And so of all the services that we do at Saprea and that you'll hear from Chris, it's that awareness that we start with and we lead with and we want to be the champion for. And if some changes happen over these past 8 years, then we're excited about that, and we will take it from anywhere, right? Like, we don't need to be the one that gets the recognition, right? We just want it to happen. And then also just kind of go back to one other thing that you said about starting a nonprofit. One thing that I've learned is that it's harder to fundraise for operations, for salaries, for overhead. And so if a company does get behind it like we did with Younique, and you can, I guess not just incubate, but take care of the overhead, it's a lot easier to get the community, right, to support it when they feel like their dollars are going towards programs, towards healing. And so that's something that I think that we also did right in the beginning, is we've given tens of millions so that the healing services can be there, and then right now those that give can go towards the healing.
A little bit on some of the data and what we're seeing. So I'll just put maybe a brief story or anecdote behind some of this data. When we walked into a business 8 years ago and say, hey, we're being incubated here by Younique, we want you to come on board to help, the business leaders would say something like this, and it's literally in whispered tones: what you're doing is really important, but it's just a little too sensitive for the workplace. That's the response we get. When we go into businesses today, because we're trying to scale, and Younique alone isn't gonna fund that scaling. We need support from a lot of other places. The response is, I don't know how we're gonna help or what we should do, but we wanna help. That shift has been significant, and some of the things that have driven that shift over the last 8 years, Me Too was a major player in that. Set aside all the politics of Me Too and how our parties love to politicize things like that. It's been really, really good for getting the American public to start to acknowledge that there's something here. Because you have to think about this. As a developed country that's as sophisticated as we are and as advanced as we are, we have this big, ugly secret that we've hidden for a long time. And here we are sitting in 2023 going, maybe it's time to address it, maybe, right? So in terms of data, the majority of Utahns, so over 50% of Utahns, still perceive the issue as an issue, but an issue that happens to other people in other places. So sexual abuse happens, but it doesn't happen in my family or my neighborhood or my faith community or my workplace or my elementary school. That number is shifting, but the majority still otherize that issue. Another interesting statistic that we're starting to see shift is what percentage of Americans believe the issue is even solvable. The Moore Center out of Johns Hopkins suggests that only 30%, a third of Americans approximately, believe child sexual abuse is even a solvable problem. Think about that. It's like, as human beings, if we don't feel like a problem's solvable, guess what happens? We're apathetic, we're indifferent. It could be the ugliest problem in the world, but if we don't think we can solve it, we're like, yeah, that's an ugly one, let me move on, right? That has to change. That stat has to change. So there's a lot of movement going on around that right now. In our state specifically, we have a lot of state leadership, government, religious, business, education that are coming together and starting to collaborate around this issue. That's probably the biggest sign that says we're ready to start dealing with it. It's not just nonprofits that work in it that are coming to the table. The fact that you've had us here twice is an example of what I'm talking about. We're ready to throw our weight behind this issue and face this big ugly thing that's gone on in our families and in our societies for far too long.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking a little bit before, and this is anecdotal, but I was with 4 friends. One was a friend for about 2 hours, and the other really good friend, and the other was a recent friend that I'd known for a couple of weeks. And we were at a function where you guys happened to be at, and you guys had some material, and this was the topic was the preventative material, because you mentioned after the fact, like repairing and then preventing as well. And the topic was brought up, and 2 out of the 4 had stories and had been impacted in their families. And they talked about it for a solid 30 minutes. And that would not have happened 10, 15 years ago in my little example here. And that's why I thought it was great that you guys are here again, because we can kind of show these mile markers and the momentum improving in a really good way. To that point, again, you were on a panel we had recently, Chris, I believe, for mental health. And what you guys are trying to repair and prevent really is tied closely into mental health. Can you speak to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I want to comment on your experience really quick, though, because there's a really important takeaway in what you just shared. What we know from societal change, like if we look back at historical societal change in our society, there are several factors that lead to broad societal change. Like if you look at the civil rights movement, or you look at smoking cessation, car seat safety, there are certain things that have to be in place for those changes or those shifts to happen. One of them is people willing to share their stories. The fact that those two people felt maybe not comfortable, but willing to share their part of their story is part of that shift, right? And that's something we're seeing significantly right now, is you're getting a lot more people that, whether they themselves are survivors or loved ones are survivors, you're hearing a lot more people starting to share their stories. That matters a lot in bringing about societal change, because what it does is it creates proximity. So Derek said every one of you know child sexual abuse survivors, and based on our experience, I know there's some of you in the audience that are going, I don't really know somebody. He's right, you know them, you just don't know that they're survivors because they haven't disclosed to you. But as they get more comfortable, they will disclose, and the moment you experience that proximity, it's like, somebody should do something about this, right? Why, in my life, and I'll be careful because it's their story, but I have people that are the closest people to me that I've known for some my entire lifetime because they're family, and some 20, 30 years that didn't disclose to me till I worked in the industry. These are the people that are closest to me, but they wouldn't disclose because of the shame and stigma that our society's put on it. That's shifting. And it's huge in causing the societal level shift to cause us to go, okay, maybe we should do something about it, because we all of a sudden are proximate. It's no longer somebody else somewhere else, it's my family member, it's my coworker, it's my neighbor, my spouse, whoever. In terms of the mental health connection, I'll just share a few stats to make the connection. And these are corollary stats, and as the saying goes, correlation is not causation. But when you have enough corollaries stack up, researchers know to pay attention that there's something here. So let's take suicide as an example. A woman who's sexually abused, 30% of those women who are sexually abused will attempt a suicide by age 30. So if we want to address the suicide, by the way, I said attempt, not think about. If we want to address suicide in our society, we need resources for when people are suicidal, but if you really want to solve the problem, you have to go upstream to the early childhood trauma that they're responding to. Sexual abuse is one of the big three. There's others, physical abuse, neglect. There's many others, but those are the big three. If we want to solve suicide, we have to go upstream. 85% of individuals, this is both men and women, who were sexually abused as a child have a diagnosable mental health disorder by age 30. If we want to solve depression and anxiety, it's not all caused by sexual abuse, but sexual abuse is one of the major inputs that creates later life mental health issues. It's post-traumatic stress. And the way that trauma works is our bodies are designed to deal with stress response for a certain amount of time. But when those stress responses are overactive for an extended period of time, that's when they appear and start taking their toll. That's why a lot of us experience a lot of mental health issue in midlife, because it's finally, as some researchers say, it's finally presenting its bill. And it's no different with child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse presents its bill on average in your 30s and 40s, not when they're 10, 15, or even 25. it presents its bill, unresolved trauma presents its bill in midlife. So when we look at the mental health crisis, I could share other substance abuse, eating disorders, there's stats behind all of them. When we look at our mental health crisis and mental health in the workplace that we're starting to pay attention to, there's no quick fixes. We like to point at like the pandemic, and yes, the pandemic accelerated mental health issues in our society, but it did not cause the mental health issues in our society. The mental health issues in our society that we're dealing with today were rooted 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, depending on the age of the person. Most mental health issues are rooted in something in our childhood. And until we as a society are willing to grapple with not only abuse, but any other trauma in childhood, we'll never get ahead of these issues. We have to deal with that upstream cause that leads to later mental health issues later in life.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a frustrating thing to have to deal with a problem that was caused 10, 15, 20 years ago, but it's really the only way, right? You guys have ways to deal with those that have been impacted, but again, the material that we got from y'all was preventative, right? Because the best way to solve the problem is to have it never exist. You also, there's some more stats. The cost of economics, money for survivors individually, and then as well as the American economy, if you could share those.
Yeah, I'll share the stats. Maybe Derek, do you want to just share the costs that you've witnessed in survivors that's not necessarily a number? That cool?
Yeah.
So I'll share the numbers really quick. The cost to a survivor over their lifetime to deal with the impacts of child sexual abuse, this is to a single survivor, is estimated at a little over $272,000 over the course of their lifetime. Think about the economic impact. That's just one person. Think about the economic impact of them having to shift their resources to deal with that. When we look at Harvard Flourishing Index on survivors of child sexual abuse, the place they perform the worst is in financial health and stability, because they're shifting their resources to deal with that trauma, both in care, but it also, that trauma limits their upward mobility and earning potential. So they have higher dropout rates. They complete college less often because they're dealing with the repercussions of the trauma, right? So we think about the impact on our workforce, and the survivors that in our workforce, they're less likely to promote in our organizations because they're distracted with their trauma, and maybe even distracted with the secondary coping mechanisms like substance abuse to deal with that trauma that impacts their effectiveness at work. So when we look at overall economic impact on the United States, the estimate is a little over $9.2 billion a year, and that's just to respond to it. That doesn't consider all the opportunity cost that comes and the economic impact of the opportunity cost. So just to respond to sexual violence in our society, it's over $9.2 billion a year in the United States alone. So huge economic impacts.
Yeah.
I don't know, Derek.
Yeah, and I think as we talk about the life of a survivor and some of the unseen impacts and the toll that it takes, I'm not an expert, right? We have a clinical staff that are the experts, but in terms of what I've observed, both by those who I love and care about deeply, and then just kind of broadly as we've been doing this work now for 8 years, I think oftentimes a survivor has ongoing effects which they literally don't even realize are tied to that childhood trauma. And that's one of the, I think, most satisfying things that I hear about that happens at our retreats, right? So we have a few things that we focus on. One of them is the phrase we call healing the one, where we hold a 4-day retreat. There's one here in Utah and there's one in Georgia. No cost to the survivor, right? They come and for 4 days they're in this safe environment, right, with the therapist, with others, and they take, I think, oftentimes the most important and significant thing that happens for them in those 4 days is the moment when they're taught about the brain's ongoing response to their trauma. And they can utter the phrase, oh, I'm not crazy, or I don't, like, okay, that's why this happens, right? When I'm in the grocery store and I walk past a man who smells a certain way, right? She doesn't, all she knows is she thinks she's having a panic attack for no apparent reason. And so to give someone just that knowledge to then feel like, okay, yes, this is trauma. I mean, that's such a beginning point that I take so much satisfaction that we can offer that, right, to these women. And then I think the other thing that they take away from the retreat, which I love, is ongoing friends for life, right? They're often in 3 groups of 8 is how we host them at our retreat down in Springville. And those other 7, right, they are sisters for life. They have a bond that goes beyond any other therapeutic benefit that we can offer at the retreat. And so those were 2, I guess, things that I thought of when you asked that question.
We're going to open up for questions from the audience here in a second, so if we could get the microphone ready. I want to hit on that point because Cynthia, who's on your team, was explaining how these symposiums work as well. And there's ways to do these events where there's somebody telling you what it is and how it is and why it is, which is fine in some instances. But then the way you guys have thought about it, and I didn't realize until you had mentioned this, Derek, was like they're becoming friends for life and building their own network and structure where you guys are the platform, but you don't have to manage everyone's interactions and facilitate everything. I would assume like they form their own friendships outside of the events and the symposiums, and it's more helplines. I would assume for these folks if they do have an event where they're sad or they've got some sort of a panic attack, the network expands exponentially. Is that an accurate assessment where they can have more help?
Yeah, so Dr. Betsy Kanarowski, our Chief Clinical Officer, always says, I love this statement, she says it over and over again, trauma happens in isolation, healing happens in communities. And it's no different than other things we're seeing. You see a lot of community work around substance use and other types of recovery with child sexual abuse trauma, taking away those shackles of that shame and stigma by being in a community with other survivors that get you without you having to explain yourself is very, very cathartic and healing in and of itself. Without any programming, without any interventions, just being with other survivors that get you so that you do not feel alone in and of itself is healing. So it's a big part of why several of our programs are done in group settings. The research behind it is catching up. It's an interesting thing in mental health that group settings were showing to be effective before any research had really said you should do things in groups. The research is finally catching up that is validating why group settings are so critical. And if you can imagine having this deep, dark secret that everybody told you to keep a secret, and your perpetrator even threatened you that if you didn't keep a secret, there would be some harm, and you've lived with that for 20 years or 30 years. We have people that show up at our retreats that haven't even told spouses, in some cases, told parents that they are survivors. If you can imagine having that type of secret, and all of a sudden being surrounded with 7 others that get you without you having to say a word, that understand you without having to say a word. Can you imagine just the relief? That's why group settings are so important, and why group work and group healing is so critical in a lot of aspects of mental health, but in particular with child sexual trauma.
Yeah, that is very interesting. When I was little, I was on a hunting trip, and we were in a cool little restaurant, coffee shops, really small town, and there was a table of 5 probably in their 70s at that point, and they looked cool, and they seemed to own the room, and I was like, man, what's going on over there? And they happened to all be World War II veterans, all in the Marine Corps, and the person I was with said that's once a week, rain or shine, they get together, and nobody else even considers going over there and bothering them. So they were just self-medicating with each other. You don't need to be a PhD to know what they were talking about, right? And my guess is it was the best part of their week, would be my guess. All right, let's open it up for questions. Get your courage up. I know there's going to be some. Are you guys able to stick around for a minute after for those that don't get their courage up?
I definitely can. I know Derek has to run a little faster than I do.
So if you want to ask questions to both, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone out. Start over there, and then we'll just keep moving around.
Thanks for this. I appreciate it. You mentioned that the trauma happens in isolation. Healing happens in communities. How do you go about preventing that isolation from occurring when you're noticing it happening and really want to call someone out on it, but their MO is, oh, I feel like kind of threatened, right? And so then they might hide that individual. Hide meaning like they might move away or take them away or not come to family events or whatever it is. How do you kind of go about kind of breaking the ice of helping somebody realize they're not in a good spot, and it's okay that you know that they're not in a good spot and you want to help?
I'll take this one. So there's two answers depending on the situation. If you know abuse is happening, don't intervene. You have a legal responsibility and a ethical responsibility to call the authorities and let them handle it. If you see something that you're uncomfortable with, like, man, it looks like that girl's being groomed by her uncle, and I don't like what's going on there, or that boyfriend's trying to really isolate my daughter from her family, but you don't know that abuse is happening, that's when we do we like to call it confronting with kindness. Those that perpetrate abuse hate eyes on them. They thrive in secrecy and they thrive in isolation. The moment they have eyes on them, they're unlikely to continue to target that child or individual. So if that uncle is grooming the niece, and you're the brother or brother-in-law, and you go up to them and say, look, I'm not comfortable with how you're interacting with so-and-so. I really want you to stop that. A conversation like that usually will stop it. It doesn't mean it'll stop them from abusing, because they'll probably move on to someone else that's a low-risk person. But you have to understand, most perpetrators perpetrate against many children. So even though they may perpetrate against another child somewhere else, you are actually impacting the amount of people being perpetrated against. Perpetrators tend to be opportunists. The exception to that, though, and the reason why I brought up the boyfriend example, pedophilia or adult perpetration against children is very different than minor on minor. And minor on minor perpetration accounts for a little over half of all child sexual abuse. It's just as impactful negatively, but it's much more preventable. If it's minor on minor, I'm trying to team up with the other parents. So I'm going to have that conversation with the parents. If they won't team up with me, I'm intervening, no matter how much my daughter gets upset with me. So I'll just give you a real life example. This week, my daughter, 9th grade, is walking home from the bus, and she has what she thinks is a 7th grader say this to her. I'll be your 6 if you'll be my 9, referring to oral sex. And she's like, what? Right? And she comes home and tells me that's something that's important to understand. She felt comfortable enough to talk to me. That got set up by hundreds of other conversations before then, right? And I got to have a conversation with her right then on how to handle that situation and where I need to intervene. That's what prevention looks like. There's a million things behind that experience that made that experience happen, that made her feel comfortable enough to talk to me about a boy in junior high talking to her about oral sex. The fact that she even knows what that means, there's a lot that goes into that, and is educated about it, so she can talk to me. But that's what prevention looks like. In that case, if that boy keeps targeting my daughter, I'm having a conversation with the parents, and fast. And hopefully together we're intervening, because that boy needs just as much help as my daughter. That's very different than a pedophile. But if he assaults my daughter, the impact on my daughter is no different. But what causes him to assault my daughter is very different than a pedophile that's an adult perpetrating against my child. So those confront with kindness conversations matter a lot, and they're very uncomfortable. You just have to do them. There's no trick to make them comfortable. We say embrace the awkward. It's going to be awkward. It's going to be uncomfortable. You just have to do it.
So thanks, guys, for being here. I really appreciate it. Close to my heart subject that you guys are talking about, and I'm a little boggled, I guess, and maybe frustrated, but help me understand. I'm curious about the shift in the conversation that's happening, and people are more willing to have that conversation now. In the early days of the foundation, and even today, I guess I'm curious, do you guys get frustrated by it even still? And what, like, is it shifting in Utah? Is it shifting nationwide? How's it? I have so many questions, I could keep going, but you guys go with those two for now.
It's shifting in Utah at a faster rate, but I think we were further behind than some places in our country. So we're catching up, but we're also moving fast. And so it doesn't frustrate me, because I worked through those anger stages early. Right now, I'm filled with hope. Like, I am pumped. This is awesome what's happening. There's this ugly thing that's been going on since the beginning of time, and this is the first time in our history we as human beings are saying, this is bull, and we're not going to keep dealing with this. There's so much hope in that, but don't get me wrong, there was a lot of anger prior to that hope. And so the fact that you are feeling some frustration, that's normal, right? We go through the grief stages and all sorts of things, including coming to a reality of something ugly in our society. So, go through the process, allow yourself to go through that process. But I rarely get frustrated anymore, because I see people coming to the table. I see people willing to find ways to contribute. I see people speaking up. It's like, this is movement. And another thing to realize is, coming from my background of being in for-profit and tech, the point from A to B, from creating a widget or creating a piece of software to be able to sell it to having success as an organization is fast. When you're talking about something like sexual abuse, you're talking about generational change. I've had to come to accept that I'm investing in something that hopefully my grandkids will benefit from. Yeah, my kids are going to benefit too, but I think it's a pipe dream for me to say, man, we're going to solve sexual abuse in the next 5 years in America, right? That's a pipe dream. But you have to shift your perspective to, hey, the civil rights movement didn't happen, even though it culminated in the 60s and 70s, it was happening in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s and the 20s, and right back even a pre-1900. There was a lot that built up to that groundswell movement that we call the civil rights movement. The same thing has to happen with sexual abuse. If I'm not willing to invest in it, who, if not me, then who? So I have to accept that it's okay for me to invest in it without reaping all the benefits, and hoping that future generations will reap them. So those are some of my perspectives to your question. Thanks for asking about it. Oh, you asked about nationwide? Yeah, it's moving nationwide too.
I always forget about this side of the room because I can't see him. Were there any questions over here? Oh, I thought there was one more over here. Incorrect. Oh, there it was.
So I'm a new father, and also
Congrats.
a bishop, which is, so I see the 1 in 5 statistic you throw out. I see all the time people in my office saying, yep, I had the struggles you're talking about. So as a new father, I'm always scared to get babysitters or to do any of those things because I don't want to expose my kid to that, those possibilities. What advice do you have for people like me?
I'll take that, and then I'm sure Chris can give a more scientific, probably proven answer. But yeah, I have 5 children, and my first 2 were girls. And then, so then being made aware of this, during the time period when my girls were kind of growing up, right, I definitely wanted to be proactive. And fortunately, my wife, Shalane, has really led the charge here, because what she did, right, like, I thought it was going to be more like seminal moments. Okay, we're going to sit down and talk about this, but that's sort of the opposite of what I would advise. I would say it's an ongoing, comfortable conversation. It's all the time. And it's anything from this person, he tends to always tickle me, right? Like, I don't know why, right? Like, I ask him to stop tickling me, and he isn't stopping tickling me. It's not about you diagnosing whether that man has a bad intention or not. Your daughter isn't comfortable with how much he's tickling her. Therefore, it has to be addressed. Even if he has no sexual intent, her being comfortable talking to you and then you helping her through that situation, all it takes is a couple of those, and it's awesome, right? All 3 of my daughters, they have this phrase already ready. My body, my rules. And they try to apply it when I'm having, right when they have to eat their veggies. And I'm like, that's over-application of that principle. No, Dad, you always say, my body, my rules. I don't want to have vegetables, right? But that phrase is always said through, right in our house. Her body, her rules, and if she's not comfortable, then she knows that she can talk to us. And then it's a lot easier.
That was a very scientific response, actually. I'll just add a couple of points and maybe one quick story to reinforce what Derek was saying. Is it starts now. You just there are things like in the first 2 years you're teaching them about their body. That's part of prevention. In ages 3 to 5, you're teaching a lot about privacy and respecting privacy and boundaries. That's prevention. So when Derek says it's the little talks, that's what we call them. It's a lot of little talks. Yes, you have the big talks mixed in, but it's a lot of little talks. And what you're looking for is making that conversation very normal and natural, just like Derek said. So that same daughter that came in, that I shared the story about a minute ago, 2 years ago, I was driving her to dance, and KSL was on, and a commercial comes up about erectile dysfunction. She says, Dad, what's erectile dysfunction? I just answered it normally, right? This is what it is what it's for. And I looked over at her, and she's just sitting there, and I'm like, you glad you asked me? And she said, no, Dad. but here's the important point. She said, but I'm glad I know, right? You have to have that type of relationship with your kids to reduce risk. It's not about risk elimination. We cannot eliminate the risk. We're reducing risk. The only other thing that I'll say is, even if you have busted your tail to reduce risk, and I think about this every day with my 3 daughters, there's still a risk that they're going to be abused, even though I'm an expert in the field. Just as important with risk reduction is how I respond if something does happen. And the beauty of that is, even though it'd be horrific if something happened to one of my children, if I deal with it right then, the chances that she'll deal with the long-term impacts and the post-traumatic stress go to the floor. What causes the problems is unresolved trauma, more so than the traumatic experience itself. And I'm not saying we want the traumatic experiences to happen, but it's the unresolved trauma. So even if something does happen, being prepared to respond in a way that reduces the impact. So between the two, the prevention side and reducing the risk, and then response side, that's what we're after.
Hi, I'm not totally sure how to ask this question, so I'm just going to give it my best shot. I have a close loved one who is a survivor of child sexual abuse, and I've been kind of texting her throughout this from the things you've been saying, and one of the things that stood out was that the more we talk about it, the the way that can help everyone understand the proximity and can make that shift happen. And we also, I think I've seen statistics that say that it's very common for the perpetrator to be a part of the family. And one thing that my loved one is saying is, I don't know how to talk about it without hurting that person that's part of our family. And so what advice would you give, or how would you take that on?
I would say that that she needs to be empowered, first of all, right? And her healing is not contingent on whether she has to ever confront that person, right? That abuse is in the past. She is hopefully safe now, right? So that I don't think that it's like any sort of requirement that that person be confronted. Now, there's also, I think, a lot of situations where it should be, but I forgot the main thing that I was going to say. I'm sorry. What was your question? Was just how?
Yeah, how can we talk about it and help other people know that it's happening without, she doesn't want to cause this person in our family to have negative repercussions or,
Chris,
or that
what do you
kind of
want to
thing.
add?
Yeah, let me add to it. So Derek hit on some key points. Particularly, she needs to be empowered. When you're abused, your choices are taken away from you. The worst thing we can do in responding to someone that has been abused is take choices away from them. She gets to choose whether she tells her story. She gets to choose whether that's public or private. She gets to choose if she pursues legal repercussions for her perpetrator. What our job is in supporting her is making sure that we have her back in making those choices. And the challenge is, without knowing the specifics of the situation, the first thing that comes to my mind is the most common thing that causes a survivor to say, I don't want to cause those waves, is that someone or somebody, including the perpetrator, put on her shoulders the responsibility to keep it secret. Someone needs to make it okay for her to let go of that burden. She has to choose to let go of it. You can't do it for her. But someone needs to say, it's okay. It will be hard in the family, but if you want to do this, I've got your back. Yeah. I'm here. That's what we have to do. We need to be really careful that we not do it for her. That's not true with a minor. If it's a minor, we have a responsibility to intervene in their behalf. But if she's an adult at this point, we need to make sure she has the power to do that. So it flip-flops based on whether they're a minor or an adult. So if I were in your shoes, what I would be communicating, say to my sister, is I've got your back. If you want to bring it out, I'm going to help you and I'm going to be there for you through the whole way. He doesn't deserve privacy, or she doesn't deserve privacy, whoever that perpetrator is. So you have no obligation to maintain it. If you want to keep it private, that's your choice, and I'm going to honor that choice. But they don't deserve privacy. They don't deserve privacy. So don't do it for them. If you choose to do it for you. And make sure that they know very clearly that you've got their back and are going to empower those choices.
Chris and Derek, thank you so much for joining us again. Congrats to all of you and your team for the amazing work that you've done and the clear milestones you're reaching and surpassing. By the way, there's tons of resources on your website. It's a good, safe place to start a lot of these questions, and the website is?
Saprea.org, spelled SAPREA.
Easy enough. Thank you for joining. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.